but you had reached out to me on Psychology Today about existentialism and its use in psychotherapy. We don't have to begin there. We can begin anywhere. Maybe a little bit of Jewish geography, because you've lived all over the place. And you're 3 generations of your family, too.
Okay. Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much. I feel really connected. It's been really wonderful connecting. 3 generations Jewish geography. 3 generations. I feel connected to 15 generations. I feel my ancestry all the way back.
Okay.
My family's from many, many different places, wandering Jews. Hungary, Austria, Tzfat. Very connected to my ancestry and from Holocaust descent, 3rd generation, very much in line with and connected to being the experience of displacement. And I grew up in Canada, in Montreal.
And how did they end up in Montreal?
Yeah, my father's a rabbi, and so they traveled all over. My parents had a 2-year honeymoon in South America where they were pilgrimaging from community to community, visiting people in prison during coups and embargoes, like really in the 80s. So just ending up in Canada is the least of their large story, the large history.
Right. So they're still they were still pilgrimaging in Canada. Although I heard your father had a really bad stroke.
Yeah, he did have. In 2011, he was locked in, and now at this point he has more movement, but he's been on a spiritual journey, so he is still a pilgrim, and my family kind of following behind him as we come to his bed and we caregive.
Right.
Yeah.
And was your grandmother on your father or mother's side who was who escaped at the last second after the train, right, in Hungary, I think?
So my grandmother from Hungary, my father's mother, was a Holocaust survivor. She was in Auschwitz and in Bergen-Belsen.
Okay.
But my mother's father escaped right after Kristallnacht, right after the Night of Broken Glass.
Yeah.
And I kind of came to this revelation pretty recently that when my grandfather was in bondage, my grandmother in Hungary was in freedom. And then when my grandfather was in freedom, my grandmother in Hungary was in bondage. In that experience on different sides of my family, but both kind of always interconnected.
And when did they meet?
They're when my parents met, because they're grandparents from different sides.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you were born in Montreal, you said, right?
I was born in Sweden on one of the pilgrimages.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how long in Sweden? Just
a little bit, but Sweden was the place of refuge for my family. It really was. So my grandmother and my grandmother's liberation was in a sense in Sweden. She came to Sweden right after liberation.
Okay. Right.
And she was 17 and wrote a poem, of this kind of strange experience following a great, enormous travesty and she wrote poetry, kind of process, and she always did. She always
wrote poetry.
She always wrote poetry. She always turned her kind of suffering into art, and she was a beautiful artist, and she did mixed media as a kind of antidote and a spiritual elevation.
And
Yeah, just suffering.
and she was living in Germany at the time with Christanos, right?
My grandfather. So that's a totally different person and a totally different
Okay.
side of my family. But the truth is, you're right that it's all
Fine.
it's all housed in my body, right? It's all housed within me. All these narrative threads. So you're right. In some ways, who was the person, in a
Yeah.
sense, all of it, because I house all of it. My
Mhm.
family,
When
myself.
did you realize that? How early did you realize that?
I think I was raised in narrative. I was always kind of trying to figure out the stories, what happened, what's real, what's not real, does it even matter, in a sense,
Yeah.
because these are experiences that are so sacred.
Right.
Not to overly transition, but I think my existential self was inevitable. There was no other way for me to process the magnitude of these stories. I was a child kind of parsing through, like, what happened in 1935? Okay, what happened in 1945? Okay, what's 1948? What's that story? And just each moment in history and how my family was entangled in the kind of larger historical thread, and then just how we narrativized as human beings on this earth, how I narrativized. Yeah.
You mean told the story, narrativized? Is
Told
that
the
what
story and also construct the story, how we
construct the
construct the
story?
story, how
Right.
we interpret meaning
Yeah.
after
No, I saw that.
experience.
I saw that in the short biographies. I saw that it was inevitable for you to take on an existential orientation.
It was inevitable
It was
for me.
inevitable. Yeah.
Yeah. I really don't know that there could have been another way, in a very large sense. And I feel eternally grateful that I am grounded in ancestry and that I believe in descendants, that I kind of have this ongoing conflict that I'm the present, but there was always a past before me, and there's always a future after me,
Right.
that I'm not alone, that my impact is as large as I feel it and as small as I feel it, you know.
Does that give a lot of comfort despite all the tragedy?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Does that give a lot of comfort being connected to the whole ancestry and knowing that you're part of a thread? Does that give you a lot of comfort?
It being part of the ancestry and the lineage, and that there's a future without me, is the greatest gift. It is
Yeah.
the greatest gift to not be alone and not have the world on my shoulders. I feel so bonded to other people who do holy work, the
Right.
sacred work of caregiving.
Right.
Meaning work is so integral to the way that I live and the way that I want to live. When I fail, I evaluate myself on my meaningful impact,
Right.
whether I was intentional or not. And I feel grateful for that metric.
And you're working. Well, should we jump for a moment to the work you're doing in hospice? Because
Sure.
that would have a lot to do, or seems also like a natural outcome of your beliefs and of your identity and of your past.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, psychotherapy was always inevitable, in a sense.
Yeah.
Existential psychotherapy was always inevitable. And spirituality and spiritual caregiving was always inevitable in another way. They feel like different selves, even though they're, again, all housed within my one body, my one being.
Yeah.
So I'm right now doing chaplaincy training in hospice, while I'm also a psychotherapist. And I bounce between those two roles
Yeah.
in my day to day.
Can you
And
say a little? Can you describe a little bit about what a professional does in hospice?
Sure. So a professional chaplain, which is what I'm training to be,
Okay.
In this hospice in particular, this palliative hospital, goes from room to room, which is really, I call that my pilgrimage. Like I'm really making pilgrimage, going from room to room, knocking on people's doors, saying, "Oh, can I come in? Oh, no, are you sleeping? Oh," doing this kind of choreography, this beautiful dance of am I wanted? Am I needed? And once there's an agreement, once there's a full resounding yes, I
Right.
enter someone's world.
Right.
And I enter conversations about spiritual history, what people's kind of life story is, the large journey that brought them into hospice, right? The kind of last few months of what led up, right, to
Yeah.
hospice, to this end of life moment.
Right.
And then, you know, where they belong, if they're feeling connected to community, if they're feeling taken care of, if they're feeling loved, and if they're loving, if they're feeling connected to their larger selves. And I'm really there to be present. And if I'm allowed to, and if I'm given the kind of opportunity, the okay, I do a little bit from what my grandmother did, right? Transforming this story into a kind of uplift, into a moment of transcendence. And I offer prayer, I offer poetry, I offer whatever I can, in a collaborative, co-created way.
Yes.
And
And most of them have family visiting them, or some of them are really alone.
it is so case by case. I mean, like across the hall, you can see one family just like swarming. There's like no time alone, and another person is waiting alone. One person might be howling in pain, really crying out to the world of
Yeah.
their spiritual, emotional, physical, psychological pain, and they're howling. And right across the way, there's someone who doesn't feel an iota. So it's really case by case. It requires a lot of spontaneity, a lot of creativity
Yeah.
to be, and a lot of suppleness to be ready and present for another person. It's extraordinary work. It really has taken my psychotherapy to the next level. I feel so grateful.
Well, the level of empathy and intuition and spirituality are, at least that, are really combined in that work, right?
Yes, absolutely. There's a level of empathy, suppleness, spirituality,
Right.
flexibility, creativity, intuition, I said, but absolutely there is. But also, not everyone is comfortable with religion. And so when I come in saying I'm a chaplain and announcing myself,
Yeah.
people can be very standoffish. They can be very wary.
Right.
And I take that because we all have different relationships to everything. Every word has specific meaning to each person. I think that's the existentialist in me, right?
Yeah.
That 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 it's all kind of meaningful, and that it's specifically meaningful to each person. And so there's a lot that I do to disarm
Yeah.
before I can enter. And I think that's true of any rapport building, that you have to
Yeah.
kind of disarm in order to be fully emotionally connected.
Right.
I use a lot of the transference, a lot of the transference
Yeah.
as material, as meat for our meeting.
Right. Well, and so you're not just being a chaplain for Jewish folks, it's
No,
for anybody, right?
for anybody.
Yeah.
For anybody. I use a lot of art. I use a lot of world history and world knowledge. Talk about Sisyphus as much as I talk about prophets. You
Right.
know,
What would you say about Sisyphus, the myth of Sisyphus? There's a lot of existential metaphors in
there's
that.
a lot of existential metaphors.
Yeah. What's the most important thing or maybe not the most important, what are some of the things that you feel make the most positive impacts if you're on these
Mm.
patients? I know they're different, obviously, but just an example.
Yeah, I think understanding where someone's real spirituality is, because we can get patient files always, right? We can make predeterminations about who a person is because of what someone's past says, what a doctor says, listening to what the system says, but really staying close to people's spiritual language, their psychological language, their emotional language, what words resonate, what words don't.
Right.
So I think staying very, very close to someone's world, which is actually, Emmy Vanderzen uses this like a great psychotherapist who's a existentialist, existential phenomenological therapy. She talks a lot about Heideggerian terms, right? Like entering someone's life world.
Okay. And yeah, most people seeing this, or watching this, hearing this, won't know even how to define the word existentialism, let alone know about Martin Heidegger, we just mentioned, and also the
Sorry.
therapist. What's the name of that therapist you just mentioned?
Emmy Vanderzen.
Okay.
Who's an existential psychotherapist.
All right. So define. I know it's not easy to define these terms, but what would you, if you were, let's say, if you were having an interview by people who do those generic interviews, let's say a big radio station, and
Sure.
they asked, and it was fast, and maybe you were standing in front of a subway, and they said, "Well, what the hell is existentialism, Sapira?"
And it's noisy. It's a
Yeah,
noisy subway, and you can barely hear and call
right.
out to the void.
Yeah,
And I would say, existential therapy
yeah,
is really taking from philosophical concepts of consciousness and of meaning, of how we construct meaning on this earth. And what we do, basically, when we have that meaning. So we assume that meaning is real, and then we have to live within it. It's not.
and freedom isn't freedom. Maybe the most important value, or one of
Freedom is a very important theme, right?
them.
But there are a lot of the self-other dialectic, that there's others in this world and there's a self.
Right.
And how do we reconcile that there's a self and an other?
Another, yeah.
Yeah, and really treating people as sacred, and being treated as sacred, right? So much of our pathology stems from being lonely,
Yes.
wanting to be seen, seeking meaning, but not quite having it confirmed by our external realities.
Right. And right.
Serve.
And not being, I'm sorry, I'm going.
No.
No, and not being born with a predetermined
Right.
essence or path. Um, the idea is experience in life produces the essence.
That's right.
Is that the way you see it too?
Yeah, that's Jean-Paul Sartre says. Um, Existence precedes essence. Yeah. But that we are alive, that there's this aliveness in every moment if you just choose it.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of supple spontaneity. Yeah.
So I wasn't going to ask you, because I don't like asking generic questions. Somebody would right now ask, well, if you're an existentialist and you're a chaplain, and the chaplain implies a religious pursuit or a religious path, and existentialism very, very often, not always, is a non-theistic, a non-religious thing. So if somebody asked you in front of that subway again, and somebody asked you to reconcile those two, how do you do that? How do you do that?
My soft answer is that there's sacredness in all being, that there's a cosmos that we all recognize, that there's tiny microscopic organisms that we all recognize. We look into microscopes, we look into telescopes, and that's the grandeur and the majesty of all being. And things are consequential. And so when religious doctrine says one thing or another, it is consequential. It's not that it's gone to the wind and everything's accepted on this universe, but that there is a sacred. So existentialism acknowledges the sacredness of all that exists on Earth, the sacredness to creativity, to spontaneity, to freedom, to wanting to belong, to loneliness. Allen Ginsberg, I hope our audience knows, has this gorgeous poem, Howl, right?
Yeah.
It says
and
everything's
also
holy.
Kaddish.
And Kaddish, it's so beautiful.
Yeah. Howl and Howl, yeah. Recite some of the lines from Howl, if you can remember.
Just there's just holy, holy, holy. You can hear his voice, right?
Yeah.
Everything is holy, and he says things that are kind of sacred, and he says things that are profane, and it's all holy, right? And I think that might be my religious, spiritual, philosophical orienting system, that it's all holy, that it all emanates, the evil emanates from a place of softness, that we are all born and we were sustained in a belly, in a test tube, in a whatever, right?
Yeah.
That somehow when we were powerless, that we somehow survived, that we're from ancestors that somehow survived to this very moment, when there's a world replete with death too. There's a world replete with chaos, and yet we're survivors. We're people who really exist in this very moment, from the most lethargic in us, in our moments of deep lethargy, to in our moments of great elation. We are alive.
And what would you say? You have many identities, multiple identities. And we talked about that Stanley Kunitz poem about the layers. So what would be some, I mean, I can tell you have many, but just mention a few that are most important to you in terms of identity.
Yeah. I think my identity as a feeler is someone who feels extraordinarily, I'm so sensitive to feelings, and I lead with feeling and heart. And then I have an identity as a kind of intellectual, and that's really important to me, that I hold both. I'm of course, in like the wheel of identity. I feel my immigration history. I feel my spiritual history, for sure. I feel like an ancestor. I know I said this before, but my great identity that I carry is that I am an ancestor, and I'm beholden to my ancestors, and then I'm beholden to my descendants. And I will break free in all the ways that I need to break free. It's not I'm so beholden that I can't decide for myself. It's not that at all, because they decided for themselves. It's just that I'm in a long lineage. That's the greatest truth that I live by. I'm from a long lineage of women, of men, of people who are taught and who teach, who still teach.
Yeah. And then there's also the externals, like Israel, being Jewish, like Montreal. You've traveled so many worlds, and you probably speak at least 3 languages: Hebrew, Spanish, and French. What else? Oh, English, of course. At least 4 languages. Is that true?
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. It's a great superpower to be able to connect to multiple people, to be able to enter people's life world, right? That term again. Yeah. It's extraordinary. It really is a sacred gift to know multiple languages, to know that there are multiple ways to express one idea.
Yeah, that's right.
There's 359 other ways that things could have gone.
You mean the languages? Oh, okay.
Everything, yeah.
I thought you meant the number of languages in the world. I think
Also,
it's
also true that there are multiple countries, and you know, sometimes we think when we're a traveler and we have an experience in a place, we essentialize that place too. We said, "Oh, I went to Paris and it rained, and so therefore Paris rains." Sometimes it doesn't, and you weren't there. You know,
yeah,
I
but
think
yeah,
that there's
but
all sorts of
yeah,
experiences, and
yeah,
sometimes that's geographic, sometimes that's experiential.
yeah,
There are multiple dimensions and planes that we all exist on. And I think staying away from the literal, I think the
yeah.
biggest threat to me is the literal.
Tell me
It's,
about that. Yeah, tell me why.
I think the forgetfulness, the apathy, the jadedness, the cynicism of forgetting the magnitude of existence, of being
Uh-huh.
transactional,
Right.
overly independent and individualistic, atomized, nuclear. It just isn't. It just isn't the way. It's so obvious that it isn't the way. I really believe in meaning and direction, in community,
Yeah.
in this deep idea of love, and that it's vital. It's vital to existence.
You know,
It's
all the things you listed, every single one are at the core of we looking at the third place idea. We've done some, which is, I think you know about that. But I was just reading the World Happiness Report, which is put out every year worldwide by the Gallup organization, which is not just a polling organization. And what they find in terms of the happiness level of a country is not just self-report of the individual's interview, which is hundreds of thousands across the world, but it's also the factors. And one of the factors that's really interesting, I just read about today, is they look at countries where if you lose your wallet, like you drop your wallet, that it will be returned. And the countries that have that, there's a great deal of trust,
hmm,
huge amount of trust. I have lived in two communities like that in Amherst, Massachusetts, yes, and in Lexington, Massachusetts. And it's the kind of thing that's really extraordinary. But the things that are lacking are exactly the things that you talked about community, and then the attitudes, the jadedness, the cynicism.
yeah,
That really comes out of the, the lack of cohesiveness. One of the big factors that they talk about in happiness is how often do you eat alone?
yeah,
More and more people are lonely and eating alone. And then the biggest change worldwide has been with youth. Youth, they're hurting all over the world. And the happiness index and rating for the United States sucks. It really sucks. And it's gone down and down, especially for people under 30. Not
hmm,
so bad for people over 60, but people under 30. But when you look at the factors you just mentioned, they're all incorporated. And
yeah,
so I believe that we have to. I was going to write an article about this today, in fact, maybe. Well, encourage me, okay? Anyway, that I wanted to say that our political movements, which I'm also definitely part of, need to focus on what are the attributes that would increase happiness for the whole society or the whole world for that matter. And it is those things. It is raising, increasing, making more frequent those those attributes of life that reduce the loneliness and the jadedness and the cynicism. And we see so much of those and the transactionalness. My God, so
yeah,
many things are transactional. My slogan for my therapy is a relationship, not a transaction.
Right.
And so I live that way. I actually live that way with almost every single encounter I have. And I'm sure you do too.
Hmm. Yeah, and we really try, right? It's not the problem when you're cynical, the problem when you're jaded, when you're in this fearful, transactional, atomized response is that when you do open yourself up, it's not only community is not only roses.
Right.
Right? There are people that you don't want to interact with when you're in community. There are people there's discomfort
Right.
in relationship and growing um, and fear and pain. It's also part of it. It's
Right.
not to be overly idyllic so that when people cross over to the other side into the threshold, they step in and they see, wait a second, this community is chaos. This is institutional. This has hierarchy. This is not what I signed up for. But the truth is that it's fundamental. Like
Yeah.
it's fundamental to being in relationship is failing and then trying again and having eternal hope
Yeah.
and
And it's the vulnerability.
the
You're vulnerable.
vulnerability.
And also what you were saying about there's the good and the evil at the same time in
Yeah,
community. And let me throw you back because you would think about this a lot. The story of Adam and Eve and paradise.
right.
And both of those things exist, right?
Yeah, good and evil being sustained. I really think about that story as the kind of experience of being sustained before you remember, right? Because the experience of knowledge, coming
Yeah,
into knowledge and good and evil, is
yeah,
that you have to kind of wrestle with
right.
it.
Yeah, and the idea about the snake being the source of temptation, right? About the apple. Isn't that thing about, am I thinking of another story?
No,
About, yeah,
no, that is the story of
yeah,
Adam and Eve.
yeah,
It's such a powerful image. That story. It
yeah.
brings it
Well,
brings these ideas alive.
yeah. Is one of your most favorite parts of the Torah, Ecclesiastes, which, because it's totally existential, right? It's called
And
Kohelet in Hebrew, right?
it's called Kohelet.
Yeah.
I love Ecclesiastes.
Okay.
I do, yeah. I love wisdom literature in general,
Okay.
and it's one of the most poetic stories. I also love Job, which is a
Yeah.
even
Oh,
more
yeah.
is pure poetry and
Yes.
horrifying
Yeah.
as a story, and it really brings the question of theodicy, but without having to focus on Job. There's
Yeah.
no face. Ecclesiastes is a book all about the wandering and the wandering mind.
Mhm.
um, the tradition says that it was written by an older King Solomon, this
Oh,
older
okay.
king who had it all, had a thousand wives, right?
Yeah.
Like just had everything and was in his reflective, aged moment.
And he's looking back and deciding what? What is he thinking?
I think ruminating on life. Where's truth? What have I done? Who
Mhm.
am I as a being? What have I served? Where did I fail? And he opens the opening line, which is so bold, is translated many different ways. It's either vanities of vanities, everything is vain, or it's futility of futilities. Everything is futile, which is,
Uh-huh.
both are they're different messages, but you
Yeah.
can just feel the inner human cry, the existential cry
Yeah.
towards truth, towards revelation.
Did yeah, by the way, have you read maybe the most existential work that I've read many times is The Little Prince.
The Little Prince.
I haven't read it in French, but I imagine that you've read it a lot. I'm just guessing.
I've read it many times, and it's funny. It might be it's funny that you just juxtaposed The Little Prince with
Yeah,
Ecclesiastes, because it's a similar, right? It's a similar human cry coming from a different age point. The Little
that's right.
Prince is about this innocent, or this young, curious mind,
Yes.
and Ecclesiastes is about a kind of hardened soul that's trying to call out. But they're both questioning. They're both maybe existentialists. There might be like, we're kind of drawn to the innocent, this like these young people who are asking for, beckoning for truth, and also aging, right?
Right.
The kind of end of life.
And also his impact, the young child, on the pilot, on the
Right,
narrator, who is supposed to be the author, probably,
right,
right? Yeah.
right.
Um,
I think we're in a time on Earth, and I don't actually want to single out that one small landmass, even though both of our hearts, right,
yeah.
are so entrenched, but it's really part of the human story, right? We're part of the larger, and I really feel that it's about the blame and mistrust that is out there in this universe, that the call to cynicism is so powerful, that the
Right.
mistrust of leadership is so powerful, that holy leaders aren't cutting it for us. There's no holy leader.
Right.
That everything's subject to criticism without so much praise, or too much praise, that there's not a healthy relationship to others, truly.
Yeah, the balance. But there's also a call to even worse than that, beyond cynicism and Jaden, to violence and
To,
polarization
to
and white
polarization.
thinking and us versus them. But
Right.
the violence thing really, really scares me. And that's what might or looks like it might happen here in this country.
Yeah. I mean, I see it all over the world. Like, I
Yeah.
don't only see it amongst two peoples, right? I
Yeah.
think if the whole world put our effort towards one conflict, then I think we could do it. I think human beings are ingenious. We could come up with a solution. But I
Well,
think every us versus them has cropped up in all parts of the world, really all parts of the world. And,
yeah.
some are getting very acknowledged and some are really not getting acknowledged. The whole world is experiencing this. But there are very few communities that have had historic conflict, that have worked it out beautifully. And I'd love to see otherwise, right? I would love to see good examples. I think Rwanda has been highlighted as a good example, and I think recently it sounds like there's been more conflict again.
But we
Um,
have to do it here. I mean, we're right here in the United States. We
right,
are the good and evil, the red versus blue, the
right,
us versus them.
right.
But one side is really prone to violence. And that's what worries me a lot, and to a totalitarian look and so forth. But
Yeah,
I know that you're thinking it's slightly different than that, I think. Um, I mean, I was raised much more in a political sense. I was raised Jewish, of course, but not not so much in a mystical sense that you have. I wish I could connect with ancestors like that. I do have a famous ancestor going way back. I think I talked to you about him. But in terms of it impacting me in a normal, in a daily sense, um, I guess I'm much more impacted by history and political thinking and political action.
yeah,
And I'm going and podcasting with Johans, who's right here now, from this big, big march rally on Saturday against all the things, and all the things that are happening on a political level are also reflective of the list of things that you were talking about. Those adjectives, is an adjective anyway, of what has happened to so many people becoming jaded, cynical, and so forth. And
Yep.
every one of the actions at the top and pervasive as a reaction, it's like Newton's laws. And the reaction has been profound and it's already palpable. You can touch it.
Yeah.
So I'm worried about not only Israel Palestine, but whether we can reconcile or come up with better leaders and a better vision and something that will heal the pain here.
Yeah. I think always being connected to the hyper local, to land, to where whose ancestral land we're on, right? How we've landed here, getting very close to the facts of our own facticity, our own life, is primary, right? It's not that we're brains in a vat, that get to think endlessly without context, without positioning, that we
Yeah,
really that we
that's
really
right.
understand.
Yeah, you have to have a point of view, I think is what you're saying.
Have
You
to have
know,
a point of view, and that not everything is relative and
right.
endlessly mused on without action. I think
That's right.
praxis is as important as theory, of
That's
course.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it in another totally different context recently that artificial intelligence, AI, chat GPT, what has all the information in the world, but has no point of view, no
Hmm.
point of view. And that's what makes it, partly a vacuum, partly superficial. And that's what makes it distinguished at this point from human consciousness, because we always have a point of view.
Yeah. It's consequential to our lives, right? That you don't just say a thing without it actually having a reflection on you. That
That's
there's
right.
a reputation that gets built, right?
And a
And a
stance,
stand.
a
Yeah, and a
stance,
stance.
you know. Well, can
Yeah,
I read some of your poem, even though I can't read it? Is that okay? Maybe not. Can I?
sure.
Well, Johans, is she shaking her head yes or no? I'll ask my cameraman. I'm going to take a leap here. I'm going to try. Um, look at an word, the semantics of its definition and connotation. The word itself with longing, rings with longing. The word itself longs for its ring. The shofarot, that's plural shofar, of the redemption, as we all wait, Israel chants Al Naharot Bavel by the rivers of Babylon. Over and over, Sham Yeshanu, Gam Bachinu. There we sat and also wept until the Messianic days when we turned the Jewish nation into the Jewish family. Israel becomes the estate of Israel. I wanted to just mention for everyone that By the Rivers of Babylon was made famous, of course, by one of our heroes, Bob Marley. But he didn't make it up. It's taken from what part of the Bible? Well, it's taken from the Jewish experience when Israel was exiled into Babylon and
Right.
stayed for many years and missed Zion. Is
Yeah,
that
that is right. Yeah. I think the longing for home is a universal human story,
right?
and
Yes.
the longing for home.
Yeah, and we're a people that has a long memory, a long, long memory, and a memory that's been everywhere. Unlike, say, China, which is a very, very long memory, but it's been in one place, you know? We've been
Right.
across most of the world and yet have a long memory, which is unique, I think.
I think it's been, storytelling really is a part of culture. Every culture, American culture, every culture, right? whether you acknowledge that there's a culture or not, every culture focuses on storytelling. And I think it's a power to get your story, to really understand what your mythos is, right? What your poetic is,
Right.
what your language is. And we're from a people that mostly were not in a land we recognized. And we
Right.
had to reconstruct our Judaism. What is it going to look like without a temple or without our sanctuary?
Right. That's
And
right.
that's a story of resilience, right?
Yeah.
That really is a story of resilience. And that resilience came with creating stories. Okay,
Yeah.
no priests. Okay, no priests. We're going to come up with teachers, rabbis.
That's right.
Rabbi means to teach.
Right.
And so we're just going to figure out endlessly. And still to this day, a yeshiva is a place where they're figuring out endlessly what to do without a temple. That's
Right.
the creation
Right.
of our culture, right? We're endless wrestlers, right? That's what it means to be
Yeah.
Israel, is to
Yeah.
wrestle.
Wrestle with God. Right. Well, and you grew up in Montreal, the home of one of my favorite, probably your favorite poets, singer, songwriters, Leonard Cohen. And of
Yeah,
course, you can find so much deep spirituality and Jewish identity, and very much the stuff you're talking about, and that we both are talking about.
yeah.
What have you made of Leonard Cohen? How has he affected you?
Leonard Cohen is a prophet. He's a hero of mine.
Yes.
Um, his poetry has always been very, very, very important. He's been the kind of soundtrack of important moments in my life.
Yeah.
And he's an inspiration in two ways. One, he was poetry first and
Yeah.
music second.
Yes.
He did not let his own lack of musicality inhibit
Right.
his love for music and his love for
Yes.
poetry.
Right.
And his poems were about his icky womanizing self as much as it was cleaving to the divine.
Right. Well,
And
it was very, very autobiographical.
very autobiographical.
Yeah.
And someone who really put his
Teeth.
his poetry to the paper and shared it with the world.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a beautiful poet.
Yes.
Beautiful,
Beautiful
beautiful,
person.
beautiful person
Yeah.
with struggle, not
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No.
without his struggle.
Yeah. He's not pure. He's,
No, he's
yeah,
not pure.
he's not pure.
I
And
mean,
we don't strive for that, do we? I don't, for purity. Or do you?
I think it's a beautiful concept. I wouldn't want to rid ourselves of that concept. I really do believe. I mean, this is really my foundational belief that all humans have divine spark, that
Okay.
there's divinity in all human beings.
Okay.
And when we are not connecting with our innermost spark, that there's a tussle. There is. I do think that existence does precede essence, right?
Yeah.
But that there is a divine, there's divine in this human experience.
And as a therapist, because when you just mentioned stories, that's what I like the most about being a therapist is it's bringing out stories from your clients, from your patients, clients, whatever. So many stories, and also brings up stories of your own. I
Yeah.
think that's what I find the most fulfilling as a therapist.
But yeah, there's something so rich about the thickness of the noise between myself and a client. It's like so loud in the silence. There's really never silence in a sense, even though mouths are shut and
Yeah.
there's resistance and there's no communication, but there's endless communication. It is
Right.
so loud. There's so much going on in a
Yeah.
relational dynamic. And it's really, really for me that the story emerges in between,
Oh,
when
yeah.
they're heard,
You mean in between the silences? Is that what you
in the
mean?
in between of patient and
And
me,
the
and
client,
client and me. Yeah,
yeah. Right.
it's extraordinary how much is happening,
Right.
and it's wild that that happens in every encounter, in the grocery store, in the hum of loud New York City, that there's, sitting next to you on the subway, there's just endless hum of
That's
that
right.
relational dynamic of being dependent and interdependent. There is. But when you single just one dynamic and you
Yeah.
zoom in, it's so rich endlessly. So then you bring in some material from the past and the present
And the future.
and the future,
Right.
and you bring temporality to the atemporal,
Yes.
the therapeutic space, and you
Right.
say, why is that story from 2 generations ago, not even your own, like a fresh memory in your head right in this moment? Where is
Right.
this coming from? And
Hey, can you believe this? I have a client waiting, and I think we'll check out the story myself. But I think, and I think Johans is going to say this, that you've been the most remarkable person on so many levels that we've interviewed. And, you're competing with a lot of people. I don't mean competing, but we've had a lot of good things. But you've taken it to another level and another dimension. And I so much appreciate that, Sapira. And I know we're going to stay in touch. And I just want to say shalom, shalom, and batzlacha, and what is it in Spanish? I forgot. How do you say good luck? Yeah, I always say that. How do you say good luck? Buena suerte, right?
oh,
Buena suerte. Buena suerte. All of that. Good luck.